Ever since the beginning of time, women have been treated as objects, as slaves, as lesser than men. For so long, none of these women were able to make any significant change. Then, in the mid to late 1900s, came a rise in the popularity of the women's rights movement, and everything began to change. Women's rights advanced greatly in the 1950s and 60s when women began to finally stand up for themselves and begin the revolution that still continues today. World War II had just ended and the soldiers were coming home, back to their perfect families and their jobs. Women, many of whom had taken over the men's jobs while they were away, went back to staying at home and cooking and cleaning. In the early 1950s, women in America, especially in the suburbs, were expected to be perfect housewives. They stayed in their perfect homes all day and cooked and cleaned and took care of their cookie-cutter families.
I remember ads when I was a little girl, and the big ad would be this lovely little lady in a cute little dress, and she'd be selling a refrigerator. And just like that with her hand, it's a refrigerator. It was like, oh my gosh, I look at them now and I think, you've got to be kidding. And she was so perfect. Her hair would be perfect, and she'd have little high heels on, and perfect little makeup, and the perfect little dress.
Many girls growing up in the 1950s wanted to grow up and be just like their mothers, the perfect housewives with the perfect families.
It was very much that in the 50s and in the 50s that girls were supposed to grow up princesses and find a knight in shining armor and wear a fancy wedding dress.
There were even toys like Susie Homemaker that taught girls how to be housewives from a young age. When they weren't at school, children would play with the other kids in their neighborhood. As they began to get older, girls were told that they could no longer play together with the boys and that they had to act more ladylike.
I think I was probably around 11, and before that, girls and boys where I grew up all played together. Boys did girl things and girls did boy things, and we played dolls one day and we played football another day. And then one day I was out in the backyard and we were all wrestling, and my mother yelled out and said, "Stop wrestling with the boys." It made me feel very confused.
Girls and boys were also treated very differently from each other, and boys could often get away with much more than the girls could.
I had two brothers that were younger than I was, and they were allowed to do things that I couldn't do, like go out after supper and go to other people's houses. I actually would be brave enough now and then to say, "But that's not fair." But it never did help.
By now, it was the 1960s, and girls and women all over were more than just aware of the inequality that they faced. They were fighting back.
We didn't have a lot of opportunities in high school. Girls pretty much went. They were told you could take a particular course, a business course, and be a secretary, or you could take a college course and you could be a teacher or a nurse. And that was kind of all you could be. The thing that upset me terribly when I first was married, and I was married young, and when you're married and ready to start a household, you need things, and a woman couldn't buy things unless you had cash and went into a store with cash. But credit cards were coming into being. I was very excited. But the credit cards came, and I got two credit cards, but both of them had his name on them. So that went on for a little bit, and then I thought, this is kind of silly. Why do I have to sign his name? I have a name. I called and I said, I'd like a credit card in my own name, and they told me, no, you can have a credit card in your husband's name. That made me very angry. And I cut the credit cards, both of them, up into very, very tiny pieces. There were things that women couldn't do that without that man standing beside them that was a little demeaning.
Later on, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 finally allowed women to have their own credit. With all of this growing feistiness and the determination of women to do more in society than just sit around looking pretty or take care of people, many women began to turn to better education.
You know, as the 60s and the late 60s came along and we had more and more things going on in the country, and we were getting a little out of that whole, you know, nice little housewife stuff, then I think women started really thinking about the things that they didn't have. And women were becoming more educated. Even if you were told you were going to go to nursing school or teaching school, the more education you get, the more you see that there's maybe other opportunities for you. You know, maybe you started going to school to be a nurse, or you started going to school to be a teacher, but all of a sudden you saw that there was a bigger world out there. And then I think women started wanting more and more for themselves.
The height of the civil rights movement was another major event that encouraged women to fight for their own rights. Images of the civil rights protests and the violence and horror of it all were now easily accessible on the nightly news, and many women began to realize that just like African Americans, they needed to fight for their rights in order to make any progress.
You saw blacks marching with Martin Luther King, and you saw them being beaten by policemen. It was horrifying to me. I had no idea. I mean, again, I grew up in a little town and then moved to a little town, and you know, policemen didn't beat people with big clubs, but you're seeing people marching peacefully down a road and then all of a sudden being beaten. And these were people, again, like women, who were just trying to make known that something wasn't right. You know, they wanted more. That's something worth fighting for. And then to see them trying to do something about it, but I think that actually just made people stronger, because more and more people would join, and I think that's definitely power in numbers. You know, if you can get some other people behind you, you can make changes, and I think women saw that too.
In the midst of all of this, the U.S. was majorly involved in the Vietnam War. Because all of the men had to enlist in the draft and many were called to fight over in Vietnam, women began to take over their jobs in the U.S., similar to what happened in World War II. Women joining the workforce in these new ways helped to alter the view of what women were capable of.
The Vietnam War, I think, was a little different. I think women already were feeling that independence, and having more jobs open up because of it, I think just gave them more power, and I don't think they stepped back after that. I think it was moving forward the whole time.
In addition, the United States had just welcomed a new president, and with him a strong new First Lady who set a precedent for many First Ladies to come.
Along came John Kennedy. And then beside him was this woman who was the epitome of class. She was just, but not just that, she was bright. She was so bright, and she was, you could tell she wasn't just beside her husband, she was behind her husband.
Jackie Kennedy showed women all over America that you could be a woman and a mom and a housewife, but at the same time, you could do it all with dignity.
Dressed like Jackie Kennedy, and they wore their hair like Jackie Kennedy, and you know, but I think they did that because they saw the strength in her.
The 1970s brought many major culture changes, such as music and television shows that protested social norms.
A lot of things were happening then. Changes in music, and just the fact that women were out there speaking their minds. TV was huge, I think, in making women realize that there was another whole life out there for them. And you're seeing things like I Love Lucy, which was a woman who was out there and she kept trying to find jobs. It was a sitcom. And all of a sudden you're seeing women in a whole different way than you've ever seen women before.
The news was also much more accessible, and Americans began to see horrifying images from the war.
We watched the Vietnam War on TV every night. It was very frightening, and sometimes when you're pushed to see horrible things, don't you think that makes you feel more outspoken? But when you see something happening that's not right, or that it just goes against everything you believe in, then I think it makes it much easier to all of a sudden stand up and be strong.
After Vietnam, many women stayed in the workforce. Men came home in waves, not all at once, and they were not coming home as heroes. The women's rights movement of the 50s and 60s and the 1970s helped bring women to where we are today and brought so much power and pride to females all over the United States.
I think women are strong today, and we have wonderful choices and still have a way to go, but nothing happens overnight.